So good morning, my name is Vici. I had the great joy and honor of putting together this panel about women's equity in health, or gender equity in health. And so before we get started, I'd like to kind of go through some housekeeping details. This panel is approximately going to take 45 minutes. We're going to have a moderated discussion for about 35 of those minutes. And then for the last 10 minutes, we're going to take some audience Q&As. So if you have any questions, please put them in the comments section of the Whova app, and we're going to give those to our panelists after. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panel moderator. This is Anisha. Anisha is currently a research fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. She manages the Gender Action Portal and also is working on the WAP's Gender and Technology portfolio. Her research is in the foundations of inclusion and health equity, particularly in the wealth of research among marginalized populations. She has a Master's of Public Health with a concentration in health disparities and social science behavior from Boston University, and a Bachelor's of Arts in psychology. So please welcome Anisha.
Great. Good morning, everyone. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you, Vici, for this great introduction and putting on this amazing panel that I'm really excited for. I hope all of you are excited as well. Before I introduce our awesome panelists, I just wanted to frame our panel and ground it in some data and research so we can, so that can guide our conversation moving forward. I think this subject is obviously really important to me as someone who has a background in public health, but also currently works in gender equity and advancing diversity and inclusion within organizations, because I think healthcare in particular is interesting as it surpasses some of the other industries that I work with in terms of female representation. So if you look at the research studies behind this, it shows that women make up almost 65% of the medical and healthcare workforce, but only make up 35% of the senior leadership positions within organizations. And even worse than that, they only make up 13% of CEOs in the healthcare industry. So something I really wanted to focus on today with our great panelists, given all their experience and research within this field, is what implications does this have, both for organizations and the healthcare system more broadly, and how can we move the needle to increase the number of women in female leadership in healthcare? Another area that I would love to touch on today is thinking about the fact that women are the main decision makers behind healthcare decisions, as Linda thankfully reminded me before in our conversation before this panel. And women are also caregivers, so they're also making decisions for themselves, but also for their families. And how can we bring their priorities and their families' priorities to the table and ensure their voices and their experiences are heard when healthcare decisions are being made? So without further ado, I'm going to introduce each of our panelists. Firstly, Dr. Tamara Duperville-Brown-Lee is a physician leader with over 20 years of experience in practicing medicine and in leadership. She is currently the Senior Vice President and Chief Community Impact Officer, which I think is like the best title ever, at Extension, with a passion for creating and implementing strategies for people to thrive and live healthy and well. Tamara has throughout her career served as a champion for providing high-quality healthcare and advancing health equity that has impacted thousands of lives. Secondly, Dr. Trish Davidson. Dr. Davidson is Dean and Professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Nursing. Dr. Davidson is a global leader in cardiac health for women and vulnerable populations through development of innovative, acceptable, and sustainable initiatives. Prior to joining JHU, she was the director of the Center of Cardiovascular and Chronic Care at the University of Technology in Sydney, Australia, and professor of cardiovascular nursing research at St. Vincent's Hospital in Sydney. And finally, Linda Groib is general partner at Avestria Ventures. Avestria invests in early-stage women's health companies and female-founded life science ventures. Prior to co-founding Avestria just last year, Linda spent over 30 years investing in public and private life science companies, whether as an institutional investor, a corporate M&A executive, a hedge fund analysis, or a private venture investor. Thank you, all three of you, for being here. And to start, I wanted to ask each of you to expand a little bit upon the work you're doing in your organization, specifically in terms of gender and women's health, and why is this an important topic? Why do we have a panel on this topic in terms of each of your work? Why are we talking about this today?
Thank you, Nisha, and good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be back on campus. I'm a Harvard School of Public Health alum from 20 years ago, so it's great to be back here in Cambridge. My work is really great, and it's extremely humbling to be in this position. It is a great title. I was actually able to write it, so that's pretty cool. But it really is the work of Ascension to be able to have intention about the vulnerable populations and bring to life our mission. Our mission is to care for everyone, but have a special intention to populations we serve that are vulnerable. And how do we see them? How do we actually lean in and design care models, population health strategies, addressing social needs and social determinants so that we can actually improve health and in definition of the persons that we serve. Ascension is one of the nation's largest nonprofit and faith-based organizations, serving millions of people throughout the country in 18 states, and we have 160,000 associates. So to be able to serve at this level is really amazing, both as a physician and as a woman of color. In particular, in my work, I serve at the system office and leading our journey, if you will, on advancing health equity, so tackling health disparities, reducing care gaps where possible. And I also have a local market role where I lead our work in Washington, D.C., where recently we underwent a significant transformation of reordering, I guess, the solar system and prioritizing the person at the center. It took a really bold move at transitioning our acute care footprint, and we're building a robust ambulatory footprint. I mention that because when I think about the faces of the people that we treated in that community, many of them are women, and many of them are decision makers and vulnerable. And it's not lost on me that in the years of leadership within that particular market, women at the helm have been few and far between, and our ability to really have intentionality, I'm seeing locally in my market, but also nationally within Ascension, is the era that we're in right now. I think this conversation is particularly important because, not to quote a cliche, but women really are future, with regard to, I think, the pivot of idea and thought in our country, and especially in healthcare, especially as we make up 80% of the workforce. And if we don't have intentionality about what's really broken, and it's not women being leaders, but women in leadership at healthcare, then we're not really going to be able to move that needle. So I'm here to learn as much as to offer, I think, a perspective of a large integrated healthcare system, and look forward to the dialogue.
So thank you very much. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. And I thought I'd sort of give my comments in two buckets. One, as my role of Dean at the Johns Hopkins School of Nursing and nursing as a profession. And secondly, within a more global context, with the Secretariat of the WHO Collaborating Centers for Nursing and Midwifery. And for those of you who are engaged in public health, Director General Tedros has declared 2020 the year of the nurse and midwife. And gender empowerment and gender equity is a big part of that structure. And Tedros really believes that we're never going to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals unless we address women's economic empowerment. And we know that many big NGOs invest in women because if women are educated, they immunise their children. It's just a kind of natural sequelae. And then I think the other thing is women's empowerment, women's participation, and women's equity is really the litmus of a just and civil society. And it's not just about everyone feeling good about themselves, but these are directly related to economic empowerment as well. So I might just focus a little bit on my role as Dean of the School of Nursing. My colleagues, particularly healthcare providers, will agree that the goal is that our healthcare workforce represents the communities that we serve. And we know that there is much lesser representation of people of a range of people. I don't like talking about minorities because that is not what we basically want the healthcare system to reflect the communities we serve. So in the city that I live in, Baltimore, where it's just 60% plus African Americans, we really want our nurses to reflect that. So that really requires thinking very differently about how we recruit people, how we support people. Achieving equity just does not mean treating everybody the same way. You have to sort of accommodate different programs, and it's just really to accommodate people's lifespans. I'm very proud at Hopkins. We have probably one of the country's best PhD programs, but I challenge my faculty and say, yes, this program's great, but you've got to be committed to come to Baltimore and live in poverty for 3 years to get the benefit and the power of a Johns Hopkins PhD degree. So I sort of have to push my faculty to think, can we do this differently? And I know many of you in this very prestigious and powerful school, Power for Good, have probably addressed many of those issues, and many people probably will not be there without strategic development and really making sure that we can achieve that. And then my last comment is about men in nursing, which is something that we are really trying to work to achieve. And this is a big conversation about gender norms and gender realities. It's about the feminisation of caring, it's about the feminisation of women's work, and nursing, even though it is you work out of school, everybody gets a job. I was just mentioned one of our students on the working in San Francisco is making $130,000 in his first year, and it can be, and more than that, it's purposeful, meaningful work. But it's about how we address gender norms of caregiving, which I think are here, and nursing is seen as women's work. And my last point is how pervasive these gender norms and issues are. So the national average in the United States, men represent 11% of the healthcare workforce. But regardless of setting, they earn $7,000 a year more than women, and they are much more likely to be represented in leadership positions. In fact, in nursing, people talk about not the glass ceiling, but the glass escalator. So they're my comments. Again, thank you so much to be part of this really important conversation, which is not just going to shape healthcare, but society as well.
Hi, I'm Linda Grube. I went to HBS. I graduated in '87, a long time ago. And my founding partner, Corinne Navini, and I met at Harvard Business School, so it's important to maintain your friendships that you start here. So what we do at Vestria Ventures, we started last year, and we invest in two different buckets. We do early stage investing, and we invest in women's health, companies involved in women's health, and we define women's health not as just reproductive health, but as all healthcare issues that impact women more than they impact men, or potentially differently than they impact men. For instance, Alzheimer's very definitely impacts more women than men. Cardiovascular disease, symptoms and treatment can be different for men and women. Autoimmune disease, a lot of women are involved with that. So thinking about women's health is not just about reproduction. The other bucket that we invest in is female entrepreneurs in the healthcare life science fields. And the reason we chose those two fields is in part because we're females and our whole careers have been spent in healthcare. But if you look at those two buckets, they're grossly underinvested in and undervalued. And for me in my investment career, that's when I have found the opportunity to make outsized returns. If you just follow what all the other investors are doing, it's very hard to outperform. And I'm going to tell you a story about how we wound up, why we founded Vestria. And a lot of it has to do with Anila Jayasuriya, who's in the audience today, and another HBSer. And Corinne and I had started investing our own capital in different startup companies back in 2010. And Anila called up and she said, well, I've got a woman you need to meet. And her name is Surbhi Sarna. And at the time, Serby was 25, I think. And Serby came and she had basically a PowerPoint presentation, but it was a really good PowerPoint presentation. And she had thought about all the things that needed to be thought through. And there's a reason I'm going to tell you this story. So Serby, turns out, had severe ovarian cysts when she was a teenager and wound up in the emergency room. And so in her case, her reproductive organs were something she thought a lot about, and she had been told at the time she could never have children. She went on to go to UC Berkeley and study biomedical engineering, and then she worked at a couple of medical device companies. And when she came to Anala, she had an idea where she was going to take a microcatheter to navigate the fallopian tubes and determine whether or not the fallopian tubes were blocked. Women today, or couples today, when they start having any infertility issues, the first thing on the checklist is to have an HSG where they shoot dye up the fallopian tubes to see if there's blockage. It's only 50% accurate. We could save a lot of money and pain by just flipping a coin rather than going through this diagnostic procedure. So Serby had realized that this was a really stupid diagnostic procedure and that physicians wanted something different, but there wasn't anything else out there. So all of her data made perfect sense, and so we agreed we would invest in her. And Anala was one of her first board members, her first investors, and all of Serby's original investors and board members were women. And it wasn't because we were trying to promote women. It was just because we all said, yeah, this makes perfect sense. Unmet need, definitely huge demand, right? Perfect sense. And then 3 years into it, data came out showing that ovarian cancer first presents in the fallopian tubes. At that point, it's another thing where all the people involved happened to be women. We all knew that ovarian cancer kills people because it's found in stage 4, and until then it's asymptomatic. So if you could screen women for early stage ovarian cancer, you could save lives. Right? So at that point, Serby developed a cell collection device to put at the end of this microcatheter that would navigate fallopian tubes. And also, you can't navigate a fallopian tube. It's not like an artery. It has no structure. Serby described it to me as a wet paper towel. So in general, you'll puncture the fallopian tubes if you try to navigate them. So Serby started working on this other device, and she got 510K approval, and she was incredibly capital efficient. And she got to the point where she needed a Series B. And it's a Series B, you're going to have to reach out to a much broader set of venture capitalists. And most of you know that 90% of venture capitalists are men. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it just means it's not a very diverse community. And so diversity matters because each of us brings our experience to the table when we make decisions. So if 90% of the people making decisions have somewhat similar healthcare experiences and life care experiences, they're going to bring those strengths and those prejudices to the table. And when Serby went out to get her Series B funding, she found she'd walk in, and I think most of you know too, only 2% of venture capital dollars goes to female-founded companies. And this has gone on for over a decade, and I kept scratching my head saying, well, is that just because women are really stupid or they don't found companies? And I just wasn't buying it, right? So something's been going on. And Serby walked into these offices, and she would come back and give us feedback saying, you know, the minute I had to say vagina or fallopian tubes, the men just glazed over. And it's not a criticism of men. It's just, I think we all want to invest in and learn more about the things we already have some knowledge in. And we all have our comfort zones. And you know, if Serby walked in and was talking about something that many of these VCs knew nothing about and it often made them uncomfortable, they have so many investment opportunities, right, that cross their plate every day. Why are they going to go out of their way to go into an area that is not their comfort zone? Serby had one venture capitalist tell her to take an anatomical diagram out of her pitch deck because he said it was gross. And he said she could never raise money if she included it in her pitch deck, right? The other thing is that Survey would talk to venture capitalists and they would say, oh, that's a women's issue. And women make up 51% of the population. Women make 80% of the healthcare decisions for their households. Over 80% of healthcare providers are women, right? So is it so bad if it's a women's issue, if you're looking for ways to make money and address a big market? But so Survey eventually did raise her Series B, and a big part of it was a venture capitalist named Arboretum, and Jan Garfinkel founded Arboretum, so another woman. And Survey was able to, after 7 years, she had raised a total of $17 million. She had only spent $12 million, and she sold her company to Boston Scientific for $275 million. So what's been interesting in the community is people have paid attention to that, right? If you can make money, venture capitalists will start thinking about what you're doing, right? So when we looked at this, we said, these people who aren't investing in women's health are just missing the boat. And so for us, it was an amazing opportunity. And we really believe that women today have all the skills necessary to be successful entrepreneurs, and especially in healthcare. So that's why we founded what we did, not because we're trying to change the world necessarily, but we believe it's an amazing investment opportunity. And the other thing I'll say about Survey is you have to wonder, how many men at age 25 would have even thought about creating a device to navigate fallopian tubes? And that's because each of us brings our individual experiences to the table. And that's why diversity matters, is we all have different experiences. So that was my soapbox.
Great, I loved it. Thank you so much. Thank you to all three of you. I wanted to pick up on something that Dr. Davidson said around the need to have a diverse workforce that represents the communities that you're working with. So what are the ways in which each of your organizations, and I think you're all from really unique positions in healthcare and beyond, but what are the ways in which each of your organizations are trying to increase the number of women in senior leadership positions, whether it's through recruitment or retention or promotion processes or just creating an inclusive culture?
So I think achieving diversity is just so fundamentally important across the board. So, and I think you need to tailor and target to specific individuals and specific populations. I think particularly in a place like Baltimore, we really have to address issues of trauma, racism, and I think that is just a very difficult area and terrain, but failing to address that is really very distressing. And I hear stories from not just nurses, but physicians who are treated inappropriately because of their race, predominantly. I think we've kind of moved post-gender. And so I think what you have to do is to really emphasize building resilience. So we have targeted programs on resilience, because once you get out of school, you're in the real world and you're subject to a whole lot of drivers. But then the other things, as I mentioned, is, and we've started an initiative called Teaching and Learning as a Pathway to Diversity, Equity and Inclusion, because I think we have to embrace diversity. And sometimes, and we know many schools are reducing barriers such as entry tests, and sometimes it's not just the entry test, but it's being able to afford to do the entry test, being coached to do the entry test. I even know coming as an international nurse to license, the whole process probably cost me $6,000 or $7,000, because the way the incentives are structured, all of these companies are making their money. So I think you have to look at barriers, work with people in how to address it, and you need support. And being compassionate does not mean decreasing standards. So I think that's a really key message that I give to faculty all the time. And and I say, if you can really tell me what is the difference between a GPA of 3.2, what's the qualitative difference, and 3.35, maybe I'll have the question. But I think that's really important. I think many people look at increasing diversity as really decreasing standards. But as we've heard, all increasing diversity does is increase the strength. And just for all of these young, aspiring people in the world, in this room, you know, if you really want to really make a big difference, say continence is one of the big things. You know, urinary incontinence is in men and women. But again, it's nothing anybody wants to talk about. It's not very sexy. And basically, as the population ages, if you go into a nursing home, 90% of the people will be women. So failing to address not just sex, but gender-based differences is really important.
Thank you. Trish, it's hard to follow that. I think I'll come from the perspective of maybe an evolution of focus with an ascension. It started for us with the challenges we saw. One, for an organization, again, that's faith-based and mission-driven, we had a very poor lack of attention and intention towards really providing culturally sensitive care to the persons that we serve. Often as a default in many of the markets where we are serving persons who are, you know, charity-based, you know, who are from underrepresented minorities, who are poor, largely CMS payers. So you can imagine the challenges of chronic illness, social needs that converge, you know, with regard to their care. So when we started looking at outcomes, we were like, what's happening here? You know, and when we're talking to physicians, we're like, well, you know, we do the same for everybody, so I'm not quite sure what's happening, you know, and these are conversations I've had with physicians, you know, directly. I was like, well, let's talk about that, you know, and let's really pay some attention as to what's really contributing to this. I brought, for example, the studies that talk about concordance, patient and provider concordance, and the impact. If you have women, for example, taking care of patients, you can probably avoid mortality of 32,000 people if there were more represented as clinicians in care, or the better outcomes for people who are of minority status, Latino, Black, Native American, if you do have more clinicians that do represent their backgrounds. And when we started taking a look at that, we were like, okay, there's some things here that we can work on. Not only the outcome metrics that everyone kind of cringes to now, like what percentage do we have, but more process metrics. For example, in nursing, you know, what are we looking at with intention on women and men that we're recruiting to be a part of our nursing workforce, and their, I think, desire, willingness, and eyes wide openness to understanding who they're going to be serving and their commitment to it. For physician recruitment in particular, we have a real problem in terms of the gap of men and women, especially when it comes to subspecialty disciplines, as well as women and men for care. So how are we able to address that? Where are we recruiting? You know, are we traditionally going to the same places we always go, or are we making a point to actually widen our net in terms of where we're recruiting and going further up the pipeline? We need to start in grammar schools. We need to start in high schools, you know, reducing some of those barriers that Trish mentioned earlier. So those are some of the things. I'm going to just highlight some things that are happening with intention now. In that, there are two key programs within our organization that we are looking not only for being more robust in the front line to make sure that that representation is there, but also in leadership. As I mentioned, I think there's something to leadership. If you can amplify, I think, and provide representation at leadership, you have more people who have both intention, they have accountability, and they can actually make things happen in terms of improving that diversity. So Aspire, which is a program for high potential managers, mid-level managers, to ensure that they're identified, because how many times have we been in a room, it's like, oh, well, you know, we just can't find talented candidates, but they're there, you know, and we just haven't had our eyes wide open to that. Making sure that there is actually accountability, and part of the leader's evaluation is the lens of diversity and inclusion, as well as their recruiting and as their mentoring and as their sponsoring. Most recently, a program called GROW is just launched within Ascension that stands for Growth, Relationships, and Opportunity for Women. That's really designed for the opportunity for growth among women in our organization development, network, and mentoring. And I'm really excited about it, that we're actually launching it and that it's there. But you got to think, for an organization that's been around for decades and has 160,000 associates, of which 80% are women, we're just now having this affinity group launched, and formalizing the relationship of mentors and sponsorship and those kind of things. And I say both that to be transparent, but also that, I think progress is also happening in terms of what we can do.
Can I just make one very brief comment about how you have to address culture change as well as these strategies? Because I often have to counsel people who feel that people say, oh, you're there because you're black, or you're there because you're a woman, or you're there because you're Native American. So I think just doing these things is one piece, but monitoring consequences, intended and non-intended, is very important. Sorry,
So the only thing we're doing to promote women in leadership roles is we're funding female entrepreneurs who are in fact CEOs. Now, we do fund male entrepreneurs if they're working in women's health, but otherwise we're really just focused on the female entrepreneurs. And the other thing we're finding is that we try to put on events where we bring the entrepreneurs and VCs and the strategics together, and they're really helping each other. So they're building a stronger community.
And Linda, I wanted to go back to you for another question in thinking about how we can address the needs of our patients and community members and make deliberate actions to include them in the conversation, and specifically in research and in clinical trials moving forward. How do we ensure that marginalized groups are represented in making those claims about research and what works moving forward?
So this is really pathetic, but Corinne and I both went to Harvard Business School, and we thought we were relatively well educated, and we had both been in the healthcare industry for 25 years. And 2 years ago, we woke up to the fact that basically starting in the 70s, women of childbearing years were precluded from participating in any clinical trials. And that changed a little bit in 1993, where the NIH, who funds much early stage research, finally said, we're not going to fund your research unless you include females in the clinical trials. Then it wasn't until 2016 where the NIH said, we're not going to fund your early stage research if you don't include women in terms of animal models and cell lines. And that's where most of the safety work is done. 8 out of 10 drugs that have been pulled from the market for safety reasons were pulled because they had safety issues in women. So if you don't test for safety in women, there's a good chance that you're really not getting the data. So, and it was only last summer that the FDA put out draft guidelines. So in other words, it's just a draft and it's just a guideline that you should have diverse populations in your clinical trials. So what you should read between the lines in this is basically that all the medicines that any of you are taking, and devices as well, and much of what's taught in medical school is based on a white male model, which thank God that we have healthy white males, right? But that's excluding some of the rest of us. And my favorite story, which I first heard about from some friends at Yale, was one of the drugs that's out to treat women's libido. They were starting to see that there were some side effects when people were taking the medication and drinking alcohol. They were passing out. And so they decided, okay, we have to do a follow-on study. So we're going to give people the drug, and we're going to have them imbibe alcohol, and we're going to see how they do. So it was a 25-person study. So then they wound up asking men on the street or people on the street, how many of those 25 people do you think were women? Well, so the obvious answer is 25, right? Well, the answer was 2. So they did this study, and it's a drug for women, and it was to check side effects, and they included 23 men and 2 women. And so you just sit there and go, this is a joke, right? This isn't really happening, but it really is. And I think the first part of it is education, because I don't think there's a man out there of any race that would say that this is a good idea, right? And yet the pharma companies, it's much easier to recruit generally white males to be part of their studies. Women's hormone cycles often make clinical trials more difficult. It's just adding a variable, right? And the less variables, the more likely you are to get clean data. But that has nothing to do with how we should be practicing medicine. So right now, even though the FDA has these draft guidelines out there, the pharma companies aren't following them. I mean, I know some are trying to make more of an effort. But again, the sad thing is Corinne and I had no idea about this. We had just all our careers been hearing about patients and patient trials and patient responses. So I'd encourage all of you, when you're in those situations and someone says the word patient to you, ask them, well, what did that patient look like? Or what do those patients look like? And did you analyze the data by gender, by race, by age? Because it makes a difference.
So I think, Linda, it's fabulous that you are championing this issue, and it's just so fundamentally important. But I think it's also important to look at sex and gender as two discrete constructs. Sex is a biological assignment. Gender is the social norms that influence how we engage in healthcare. And we know that one of the major reasons women don't access care is that they don't prioritise their healthcare, because, as Linda mentioned before, they're doing all the caregiving. And do I have time to go to a clinical trial when I've got to work, pick the kids up, whatever. So I think thinking about, so definitely the sex-based differences are really important, but also fundamentally is the gender initiative. And the American Heart Association has a Go Red for Women research portal, and they're really trying to proactively try and get women, young women, particularly from diverse backgrounds, to enrol in that portal, because we're never going to have the right sort of information unless we really actively engage women in research.
Great. I think we're going to move to Q&A now. Yes.
Yes, correct. So please submit your questions. We're going to start with this first one. Do women face discrimination in receiving healthcare? And if yes, how can we work on changing that? How do we take into account women's specific needs while working on providing equitable healthcare to all?
I'll start. Yes, they do. And it's particularly, I think, demonstrative if you are a woman of color or poor in that respect, and you don't have the agency to be able to speak for yourself. I'm going to use a personal example in terms of this. You know, I was educated here, and I'm a physician, and I know a bit about, women's health and the like, being a family physician, and was seeking care on some issues that I had, and had to get an ultrasound, and not unlike a number of women of color, I was being evaluated for uterine fibroids, and I'll never forget, my interaction with a radiologist who didn't realize I was a physician at the time, but he's just like, "Oh boy, you've got issues going on here," and I was like, "Yeah, let's talk about it," and he's just like, "Well, first of all, you've got a bag of rocks." And he was referring to the number of, uterine fibroids that he'd seen on ultrasound. And I was like, okay, pro tip, don't call women's uteruses a bag of rocks, when you're talking to them. And let's talk about options, that are more sensitive to the needs of women. So it's really irrespective, sometimes of who you are. And I guess my position has always been, both as a clinician and as a leader, trying to encourage people, is that first, remember, people are persons first, before they're patients. And we're even moving away from calling all of our, people who come to seek care for us as patients. They're persons, and they have specific objectives of what they want when they come to the office. And really, that is what matters most, in the interaction between clinician and institution and the person. So let's be sensitive to that. But imagine if you're coming from a place where you don't know what to ask, you don't have that agency, that we're still pretty much the clinician is right, and particularly if you're a male clinician, you're very right. What happens then? So I think all of us have the opportunity to be agents for good. I think when it comes to that, be supportive, I think, of groups that look to do many things, from encouraging diversity and who participates in clinical trials to the last question and research, to the neighborhood and community, I think, based organizations that are really looking to educate and amplify persons in their communities of what's important with regard to their health, being prepared for clinician visits and the like. And there's so much that we can do for that. Even yourself being an ombudsman for someone as they're going to care. At some point in your life, you will be. It's for your parent, it's for your aunt, it's for your grandparent, and realizing what that interaction is like and what your voice can be, asking questions, challenging healthcare. We need to be challenged, as clinicians. We don't always know what's right, and it's only going to be in the, I think, very precious opportunity where we listen more that actually the needs are going to be met.
The second question is, as professional and personal partners, what can men do better to help improve gender equity in healthcare?
Well, firstly, whoever you are, thank you for the question. I often think no one goes into work to do a bad job. So I think we have to become comfortable with connecting, with being able to sort of challenge things. And this is a real life example of me. So I was having a bad day, and I apologize for the insensitiveness, but, and that's another thing, you come from another country, and what is kind of okay, it's not okay. So I said, I feel like slitting my wrists. And then one of my colleagues said, who's the mental health professor, Trish, that's not really an appropriate thing to say. And I had to think, no, it's not an appropriate thing to say. And so I think it's just, she approached me professionally and with a strong rationale. So I think we need learning cultures. We need to be able to address these issues. And I think we all, each and every one of us, have to be committed to change, men and women. But also I think you can really make an effort, particularly in meetings, because you're all leaders. And, I was talking to my husband, I was coming here to do this, and so he sent me this article which actually showed that women on the High Court, or the Supreme Court, translation from it, on the Supreme Court are much more likely to be interrupted than men. So I think just good meeting practices, just making sure everybody has their say, asking people specific questions, making sure that if you have women who are isolated in leadership positions or minorities, that you consider that they may feel uncomfortable. I think for all of us, even though you're the brightest and the best, imposter syndrome will never leave you. Like, I'm thinking, holy hell, they want me to come to Harvard Business School to talk to them. So imposter syndrome is never going to leave people. So just be thoughtful and intentional in your interactions.
I think,
Yeah.
go ahead.
I can make one point about the other role that men can play is they're always powerful mentors and sponsors. And most of the mentors and sponsors I've had throughout my career have been men. And I've been really grateful for that. I mean, I really would have wanted, I think, more women. But I'm really grateful for that because they were able to have, one, they were activated, right? They were already allies. But the ability for them to be that voice in the background to say, no, Tam's really got a lot to offer. She's super smart. She is actually up for this challenge has been, I think, game changer, in terms of my ability to take on a different role, be able to show up in a different place, be able to present to you all bright minds here at Harvard Business School. So I do think that there's a role for that. All of you as leaders, be sponsors, be mentors, be sponsors for people who are less likely than you. When it comes to leadership, we think about three things, right? And this is what the literature says. It's competency, it's integrity, and it's also affinity, right? So what does affinity mean? Most of us, our affinity is by gender, who we look like, who we grew up with, who'd you go to school with. But guess what? When you get to the workforce, if you limit yourself to that, you may be missing on opportunities to invite a diverse conversation. So I think thinking a bit more broadly about this affinity question and realizing that it's actually wrapped up in some biases. Quick story, I was in a hallway with a couple of my leaders, and we're all, senior vice presidents, and we're chuckling about what we're going to do on the weekend. And, Jim and Bob, we're talking to each other, and, they're just like, oh, Jim, what you going to do? Yeah, I'm just going to go on my boat this weekend. Oh, yeah, why don't you join me on the boat? And so Jim's like, okay, sure, absolutely. And I'm standing there like, I want to go on the boat. I like water, But there was no invitation, in terms of that, because I think there was just like a wall, like, well, maybe Tam doesn't want to go on the boat. Invite Tam to the boat, is what I'll say, Jim and Bob. And that's one very superficial example, but I think that there is a role that men can play, in that can be actually very powerful and game-changing.
Thank you all for your great insights. Please join me in thanking the panelists. Really appreciate it.
So thank you everyone for coming. Just a quick reminder that now we have a coffee break, and our next three panels will start at 11:15. So the one here will be about social determinants of health here in Klarman Hall. We have another one about innovation in Israel, and that's in Baton. And then the last one is about how different cultures around the world are addressing whole care. And so that one will be in Spangler, and you can go through the tunnels for that. Once again, please help me thank these wonderful ladies.